Across the world, Indigenous communities are struggling to save their cultures, identity, and knowledge systems from the threat of extinction due to its erosion by modernization, commercial development pressures, migration, lack of secure rights to land and resources, as well as various other threats, whether they are active or passive. Hence, the reason why protecting the rights of Indigenous communities is a matter of utmost importance. Greetings to my honorable judges, esteemed committee members, and fellow contestants. My name is Alicia, and in this opportunity that I have received, I'd like to elaborate on a topic that we may or may not know all too well: the exploitation of Indigenous communities to achieve financial gain. Now, the entire population of the world belongs to some form of culture, and every individual may identify with said culture in varying proportions. As people, our understanding of cultural identity begins the moment we are given birth to, and as we grow up, that understanding that we have is developed and shaped by the environment in which we are placed and interact with. Our awareness of our own cultural identity may be a loosely incorporated or even well-established guide that governs the manner and lifestyle with which we live. This reality for us is in contrast to the reality of the lives of Indigenous people, whose role of cultural heritage and identity juxtapose ours. Now, what do I mean by this? For Indigenous people, their culture is the fundamental quality of their lives, and I think we can all agree that their cultural identity and way of life is what differentiates them from ordinary people such as you and I, and what acts as their backbone and foundation as a community. The issue is, this basis with which they live is being taken away from them because of exploitation towards their communities, consequently causing them to struggle with the threat of extinction. What's more, nowadays it is occurring even more frequently, and threats towards Indigenous communities have never been worse. As I have briefly touched upon in the beginning, threats towards Indigenous people come in various forms, the most concerning ones being exploitation of intellectual property, physical removal of their natural assets, and eviction from native lands. Exploitation of intellectual property is a common occurring and active threat which involves acts such as benefiting from Indigenous people's stories, traditional ways, and artwork without compensation, because these communities do not have access to legal framework or ownership. This is a prime example of directly threatening Indigenous communities to extinction by stealing the property that holds the basis and foundation of their cultural heritage and identity. The second threat can be considered to be an extension of the first, which is the physical removal or stripping of Indigenous people's natural assets, including mineral resources, timber, water, and agricultural lands for business interests. The troublesome thing about this type of exploitation is that not only does this process impoverish the land on which Indigenous communities depend for sustenance, it also destroys their sacred sites and upsets the ecological balance that forms the foundation of their cultures. Third is eviction from their native lands, carried out by governments so that the assets of Indigenous communities can be exploited by outside interests, consequently further annihilating the existence of these Indigenous communities. Now, the question is, why is it important that we protect these Indigenous communities? If we'd like to think of it from a cruel and vile point of view, these problems don't affect us people who are not affiliated with these Indigenous communities. So, why is it considered to be a matter of utmost importance? The answer lies in the significance of the 3 P's: profit, people, and planet. Let's discuss them one by one, beginning with the first P, profit. In the case of exploitation of Indigenous communities, the only people profiting from this exploitation is, for obvious reasons, the people who are carrying out the exploitation. Meanwhile, the Indigenous community that is being exploited from are uncompensated for their resources or even labor. As a result, there is an imbalance of power, as well as socio-economic inequality in Indigenous communities. Their living conditions are not as how they should be. They have been deteriorated by external parties, an occurrence that most of these Indigenous communities have no control of. This goes against good judgment and morals, exploiting these Indigenous communities, especially because the reality is that said actions are done just to achieve personal financial gain, therefore making it unfair towards the Indigenous communities who are being robbed from. Moving on to the second P, people. Protecting Indigenous people and their rights to play an important part in their cultural heritage, which affirms their identity as a community. I'm sure all of us are unable to imagine and do not want to experience how it would feel to have our cultural heritage and identity taken away from us. So we shouldn't wish the same for Indigenous communities by aiding them in their endeavor to sustain the longevity of their identity and cultural heritage from fading away. Finally, we have arrived on the third P, planet. Did you know that Indigenous tenured lands often have remarkably lower rates of deforestation, therefore making the investment in Indigenous communities one of the most feasible and economic solutions to protect endangered species, conserve rainforests, and alleviate global warming or climate change, which is one objective that I'm sure we'd all like to see the world achieve. So, with that being said, how can we as laypersons contribute to the effort to protect Indigenous communities and their rights? Well, first, we must educate ourselves and our community about issues related to Indigenous people so that Indigenous communities' role in conservation can be recognized. Second, we must show solidarity towards Indigenous communities. Solidarity is only meaningful if it is substantive and not merely performative. This means showing up to support the community with your presence should be the baseline, not the endgame. Third, be aware of what resources we're taking away from Indigenous communities through our presence. We must ensure we have given back to the community more than we've taken away from them. So, to take everything that has been said into account, protecting the rights of Indigenous communities from exploitation is a matter of utmost importance, for the reason that Indigenous communities are struggling to maintain their existence and conserve their cultural heritage as well as identity, what with having the resources and labor be taken advantage of, all the while receiving little to none compensation. Moreover, efforts to save the environment can be easily achieved by endeavoring to save Indigenous lands. Governments must also legally recognize and protect Indigenous communities' rights to territories, natural resources, traditional knowledge, and self-determination. On top of that, Indigenous people must be wholly involved in the effort to save biodiversity. And last but not least, we too can help protect Indigenous communities by educating ourselves, showing solidarity towards their communities, and by being aware of the resources we're taking away from them. Because ultimately, Indigenous communities do not deserve the exploitation carried out towards them, especially when said exploitation leads to loss of cultural heritage and identity, as well as possible extinction of these communities. Thank you for your attention.